Lucas Brent's smile was immaculate, a polished gleam perfected by media coaches and years of carefully choreographed public appearances. But tonight, under the harsh white lights of yet another press conference, that smile was strained, more survival mechanism than charm. The allegations had landed like a sledgehammer: illicit donations, favors traded in backrooms, and most damning of all, a torrid affair with the wife of a prominent judge. The narrative had spiraled, unstoppable, and now the shark smelled blood. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. His campaign manager, a bulldog in a tailored suit named Marcus Delaney, slammed the door behind them once they were back in Lucas's office. "We need a reset, Lucas. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now, you're becoming political roadkill." Lucas, hands gripping the arms of his chair, said nothing. He knew Marcus wasn't wrong. Redemption wasn't going to come from a press release. It needed something bigger, something symbolic. That's when the word was spoken, low and deliberate. "Marriage," Marcus said, letting it linger in the air like cigar smoke. Lucas looked up, confused, almost insulted. "Marriage? Are you serious?" Marcus nodded. "Think about it. Rebirth, stability, family. You marry someone humble, grounded, with no skeletons. It humanizes you. It's a redemption arc. America eats that up." Lucas scoffed, then paused. The wheels began to turn. Miles away, in a town so small it didn't appear on most state maps, Elisa scrubbed down the counter of the diner she'd worked at for nearly a decade. Her hands moved with muscle memory while her mind wandered. She always noticed things others didn't, like how Mrs. Parker always paid in coins when she was short on rent, or how the sheriff's boy flinched when his father raised his voice. Observing had become her habit, a quiet rebellion against the world that had once chewed her up and spat her out. Elisa wasn't beautiful in a conventional sense, but there was something magnetic about her. Maybe it was the way she seemed to carry stories behind her eyes, unread chapters waiting to be discovered. So when a sharply dressed man walked into the diner that afternoon, she noticed more than just the suit. She noticed the way he scanned the room twice before sitting, the subtle bulge at his ankle, a concealed weapon probably, and the way he watched her while pretending not to. The man introduced himself as Delaney, offering her a unique opportunity. She listened in silence, never interrupting, even as he told her about a politician needing to restore his image, and how Elisa had the right look for the role. It sounded insane, and yet she didn't say no. She asked one question: "What's in it for me?" Marcus smiled. "Anything you want. You become the wife of Lucas Brent, financial security, a life you could only dream of here. And when the cameras go away, you go back to whatever life you choose." That night, Elisa sat in the dark, the offer replaying in her mind. She wasn't naive. She knew this wasn't about her. It was about control, optics, power. But as she looked at the tattered photograph of her father, a man whose name had once been dragged through the mud in another political scandal, something hardened inside her. Maybe this wasn't just an opportunity. Maybe it was a way in. 2 weeks later, in a private garden behind a cathedral older than the state itself, Lucas and Elisa exchanged vows. There were no tears, no grand declarations, just camera shutters clicking and guests whispering rehearsed admiration. Lucas held her hand like a politician shaking a donor's, firm but transactional. Elisa's smile was soft, controlled, like someone who knew the value of silence. "You're doing well," Lucas whispered as they posed. She didn't reply. She just looked at him and smiled. Back at the Brent estate, Elisa was shown her new room. Not their room. Lucas had insisted on separate quarters, claiming it was cleaner for the press narrative. The house was a monument to excess. Chandeliers the size of cars, art pieces that looked like they belonged in a museum. But Elisa didn't marvel. She explored, quietly, methodically, noting the layout, the staff, the security cameras. She was learning her new role, not as a wife, but as an observer behind enemy lines. Lucas believed she was just a placeholder, a quiet, small-town girl who would look good on his arm and stay out of the way. He didn't know that Elisa had grown up surrounded by lies so thick you could choke on them. He didn't know that beneath her soft-spoken demeanor lay a storm that had waited years to gather strength. And he certainly didn't know the name Moreno. Not yet. That name would change everything. The tabloids called it an unexpected romance. Headlines splashed. Across morning broadcasts showed Lucas Brent and his new wife smiling dutifully for the cameras, framed by garden hedges and flashbulbs. Talk shows debated whether it was a real love story or strategic genius, but no one asked Elisa what she thought, not that she would have answered. She knew her silence would only fuel the mystique. In a world obsessed with noise, silence was her power. Lucas played the doting husband well enough. He opened car doors, offered practiced glances of affection during interviews, and slipped his arm around her waist at just the right moments. But behind closed doors, their conversations were brief and loaded. "You're doing fine," he told her in the hallway one morning, barely making eye contact. "Just smile. That's all you need to do." Elisa nodded. She smiled. And then she turned away, jotting something in her small, leather-bound notebook. That notebook never left her side. Lucas noticed it once during a dinner with donors. She'd written something down after one of the guests mentioned a development deal. "From 5 years ago." "What are you always writing?" he asked, more annoyed than curious. Elisa looked up calmly. "Recipes," she lied. "Old habits." Lucas didn't press. He never did. He assumed she wasn't worth the effort. But the household staff noticed things Lucas didn't. Rosa, the housekeeper, mentioned how Elisa always lingered in the library a little too long. The gardener, Arturo, said she asked about the Brent family tree as if studying for an exam. "She's different," Rosa whispered one day in the kitchen. "Too quiet, like someone who's been watching the world a long time." No one knew how close she was to the truth. In the east wing of the house, largely abandoned since the death of Lucas's father, Elisa found her rhythm. While Lucas buried himself in photo ops and policy speeches, she wandered into forgotten rooms. In one of them, a portrait hung crooked. On the wall, a stern-looking man in a dark grey suit with cold, distant eyes. She stared at it for minutes. Something about his face. It wasn't unfamiliar. It stirred something old and bitter. That night, she searched the family archives in the office library. Names, contracts, dates, and then she saw it. The name scribbled in the margin of a dusty ledger. C. Moreno. Her hands trembled slightly. She closed the book, paced the room, then stared out at the garden, her reflection faint in the glass. "It's starting," she whispered. "They just don't know it yet." Lucas, meanwhile, began to sense a shift. His approval ratings had rebounded slightly thanks to the love story narrative, but something gnawed at him. Elisa wasn't like the women he usually kept around. No desperate need for validation, no wide-eyed fascination with power. She didn't flatter him. She didn't fear him. And sometimes, when she looked at him, it felt like she was studying a puzzle she'd nearly solved. During an elegant fundraiser at a downtown hotel, Lucas introduced her to donors and dignitaries. She smiled, nodded, played her part. But later, in the restroom, she took a photo of a guest list left unattended. On a table, one name caught her eye, an executive from the real estate firm once linked to her father's fall from grace. She texted the name to an unlisted number. "Found him," she wrote. No reply came. She wasn't expecting one. In bed that night, she lay awake in silence while Lucas slept in the guest room down the hall. She stared at the ceiling, thinking of her mother's hands, how they shook when she read the headline about her husband's suicide, thinking of the whispering neighbors, of the friends who stopped coming around. She thought, of the shame, the silence, the way truth got buried beneath power like bones under concrete. And she vowed it would not stay buried much longer. Lucas began noticing the shift in others, too. His secretary was unusually tight-lipped. His driver hesitated more before speaking. Even Marcus seemed vaguely distracted. And through it all, Elisa remained the constant, serene, unreadable, and always watching. She never raised her voice, never picked a fight, but something in her presence began to unsettle him. It was like sharing a house with a painting whose eyes you could swear were following you. One afternoon, he stood in the garden, watching her through the window as she spoke with Rosa. They weren't laughing, they weren't even smiling, just speaking quietly, heads close. He couldn't hear them, but he watched Elisa place her hand gently over Rosa's like someone sharing a secret. It made his stomach twist. He poured himself a drink later that night, alone in the study. The walls, once lined with confidence and legacy, felt oppressive now. He sipped slowly, the bourbon burning his throat. "What are you doing, Elisa?" he murmured to the empty room. No one answered. But outside the door, Elisa walked past, her notebook tucked under her arm, her steps steady and sure. The mask was slipping, and Lucas, for the first time, felt something foreign bloom inside him. Doubt. The Brent mansion stood like a relic of old power, quiet, vast, and filled with whispers. To the outside world, it symbolized legacy and prestige. But to Elisa, it was a mausoleum. Every hallway seemed to echo with the weight of unspoken truths. She moved through the house like a ghost herself, never in the way, never truly seen, but always present. And as she walked those velvet-lined corridors, she began to notice the inconsistencies, the spaces that didn't quite add up. It started with the staff. Rosa, the housekeeper, was kind but hesitant. Arturo, the gardener, was meticulous, yet visibly wary when asked about the late patriarch. Elisa never pushed too hard. She simply asked the kind of questions that seemed like polite curiosity, but landed like baited hooks. Did Mr. Brent Sr. have a favorite room? Was he ever in politics himself? Their answers were vague, often incomplete, but sometimes silence speaks louder than any word. One stormy afternoon, while Lucas was away at a business forum, Elisa wandered into the eastern wing again. This part of the house was colder, both in temperature and tone. The curtains hung heavy with dust. The air smelled faintly of mildew and forgotten years. And then she found it, a door at the end of the hall, half hidden behind an antique coat rack. It creaked open like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, a sitting room frozen in time. The walls were lined with portraits. Generations of Brent men stared down at her with expressions of entitlement and disdain. But one painting in particular drew her in, a man with piercing eyes and a slight tilt of the mouth, as if mocking. The brass nameplate read, Cornelius, Brent, 1981. Something about his face twisted in her stomach. She stepped closer, squinting, searching for something she couldn't name. That's when she noticed the initials etched faintly into the frame, CM. Later that evening, she asked Rosa casually about the portrait. Cornelius Brent, Rosa said, her voice lowering as if the name itself carried a curse. He wasn't like Mr. Lucas. He was different, harsh, secretive. Elisa nodded slowly. Did he do business out of the house? Rosa hesitated. All the time. Many late nights. Strange visitors. But that was a long time ago. Elisa thanked her with a soft smile, but her mind was already racing. In the private office once used by Cornelius, Elisa began her next search. Lucas never went in there. It was more museum than workspace now. The desk drawers were locked, but Elisa had learned to pick cheap brass locks back when her mother was cleaning offices to survive.
Inside one beneath the brittle news clippings, she found what she hadn't expected to. She sat down slowly, laying the contents out with precision.
There were photographs, black and white, grainy, some taken from a distance. One was of a man standing on courthouse steps. Another showed the same man speaking at a protest, holding a sign that read, "Justice over power." Elisa's breath caught in her throat. It was him, her father, Daniel Moreno. And behind him in the crowd, a familiar face blurred by time. Cornelius. Brent. The pieces were falling into place. That night she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts spiraled, each memory now colored by this new layer of truth. Her father hadn't just been framed. He'd been watched, tracked, targeted. And the man who orchestrated it all had passed down his empire of silence to Lucas. She stared at the ceiling again, just as she had nights ago, but this time with eyes wide open. The pain she thought she'd buried had found new breath. Lucas returned the next morning, distracted and impatient. He barely greeted her, muttering about polling numbers and ungrateful donors. "Anything happen while I was gone?" he asked offhandedly. Elisa sipped her tea, eyes steady. "Nothing worth mentioning," she said. And it was true, at least from his perspective, but from hers. Everything had changed. She began mapping a timeline on the inside pages of her notebook. Discrete entries, each name and date a breadcrumb. The more she dug, the clearer the structure became. Fake shell companies, forged partnerships and shadow donors. The Brent family had built an empire not just on policy, but on erasure. People like her father had been swallowed by that machine. But she would not be. The more she uncovered, the more Lucas's behavior shifted. He grew more irritable, more controlling. He began checking in on her more often, where she was, what she was reading. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening. "Everything okay?" Elisa smiled, warm and practiced. "I'm still getting used to this place. It's big." He laughed, brushing off the tension, but behind his eyes, a flicker of suspicion bloomed. Alone again, Elisa returned to the sitting room in the east wing. She stared at Cornelius's portrait for a long time. "You thought you buried him," she whispered. "But I'm still here." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed. It was late, but the hour didn't matter. Her investigation had become her heartbeat. Every revelation drew her closer, not just to the truth, but to justice. The mansion groaned around her like an old man with secrets, and Elisa, no longer just a waitress or a wife, stood like a reckoning. The name on the folder wouldn't leave her. C. Moreno. Her father had whispered it once, years ago, when he was drowning in shame and paranoia. She'd asked who it was, and he'd only said, "A ghost they never wanted to see again." Back then, she didn't understand. Now, as the pieces fell into place, the name burned in her mind like a brand. C. Moreno wasn't a ghost. She was a warning. Elisa returned to Cornelius Brent's office the following morning. This time, she wore gloves. Not for fingerprints. She wasn't worried about that, but for reverence. The papers she found were fragile with time. There were records of meetings, unsigned contracts, and memos written in careful script. One memo, dated 1994, caught her breath. Re Daniel Moreno, leak risk. Below, a scribbled note in the margin read, "Handled, CM Monitoring." Elisa stared at the initials, CM C. Moreno. Whoever this person was, she hadn't just been watching. She'd been involved. Digging deeper, she uncovered a scanned letter with a different kind of ink. Anger pressed into paper. It was addressed to Cornelius, from a woman named Clara Moreno. Elisa's heart stopped. She recognized the name. Her aunt. The one her mother never talked about. The one who vanished. The letter accused Cornelius of using her brother as a scapegoat to protect a fraudulent land contract. It ended abruptly, with a line that didn't feel like a threat but a vow. "You may bury Daniel, but you'll never bury the truth." That night, Elisa left the house under the guise of visiting a local women's charity. Lucas didn't object. If anything, he welcomed the chance to be alone to strategize, to rebuild his fading image. But Elisa didn't go to a charity. She drove 3 hours south into the hills of her childhood, where the air still carried the scent of earth and rust. Her mother lived in a small cottage now, kept alive by habits and heartbreak. "Why are you really here?" her mother asked, sitting at the kitchen table, frail but sharp. Elisa didn't answer right away. She just opened her notebook and showed the name Clara Moreno. Her mother's expression cracked for the first time in years. "She was your father's sister," she said quietly. "Smart, loud, dangerous. She wouldn't let it go. After your father died, she vanished. Some said she ran. I think someone helped her disappear." Elisa didn't cry. She never did, not in front of anyone. But her hands tightened on the edge of the table until her knuckles went white. "I need everything you have," she said. Her mother hesitated, then rose slowly and opened a cabinet behind the old stove. She pulled out a tin box wrapped in newspaper and handed it to Elisa. Inside, letters, photographs, and one journal, her father's. Reading his words was like resurrecting his voice. He had chronicled everything, the contracts, the threats, the day he realized he'd been framed. His final entries were scattered, more desperate. "They said I could take the fall quietly, or my family would suffer." And then, on the last page, underlined twice, "Clara has the rest." Back in the mansion days later, Elisa was no longer just observing. She was hunting. Each staff member became a potential witness, each room a crime scene. She returned to the archives with a different lens now, looking not just for secrets but for signs of Clara. And then she found it, a charity gala photo from 1995. There, just beyond the main crowd, stood a woman in a red dress, partially turned, holding a folder. She wasn't listed in the caption, but Elisa knew that face. Lucas started noticing changes in Elisa's demeanor. She wasn't playing the same part anymore. There was something in her eyes, like a locked door behind them had finally opened. "You've been busy," he said one night at dinner, trying to sound casual. She looked at him and offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This house inspires curiosity." He didn't like that. The following morning, Lucas called. "Marcus." "She's hiding something," he muttered into the phone. "Then dig," Marcus replied. "We can't afford surprises." But Elisa had prepared for this. She'd created a new version of herself online. Schoolteacher, part-time artist, no trace of the Morenos. She scrubbed her past so clean even she wouldn't recognize it. Lucas's attempts to trace her hit dead ends, and with each failure, his paranoia grew. "She's too perfect," he muttered in the study. "Nobody's that perfect." In truth, Elisa wasn't perfect. She was furious and focused. The ghosts in this house weren't just shadows. They were voices guiding her hand. And now, she wasn't afraid to follow them. One night she stood outside Cornelius's old office, staring at the door. She touched the knob, cold and worn, and whispered to the darkness, "I remember now." Her voice was soft, but in that moment it felt like thunder, because now she knew the truth wasn't gone. It had just been waiting. The train ride back to the interior town where Elisa had been raised felt different this time. Not nostalgic, not sentimental, just heavy. Every turn of the wheels was like a clock winding down toward reckoning. She hadn't been home in over a year. Too many reminders, too many scars tucked between familiar landmarks. But now the journey was necessary, not for comfort, but for answers. Her mother, Teresa Moreno, greeted her with a weak smile and trembling hands. Age and illness had thinned her frame, but her eyes, Elisa's eyes, were still sharp, still watchful. The house smelled like chamomile and old wood, the same way it had when Elisa was a girl lying awake during the nights her father didn't come home. Now she was the one bringing ghosts to the doorstep. "You look tired," her mother said as they sat in the faded living room. "Big house, not so restful?" Elisa offered a faint laugh. "Too much quiet can be louder than a crowd." Her mother nodded. She always understood Elisa's silences. They spoke more than her words ever could. Later that evening, after the soup, and after Teresa had drifted into a shallow sleep, Elisa wandered into the attic. Dust hung in the air like fog. Boxes were stacked like forgotten stories. She rummaged slowly, respectfully. And then she found it, a rust-red box marked with a dried daisy taped to the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowing fabric, was a journal bound in soft, worn leather. She sat on the floor and opened it with reverence. The handwriting was her mother's, neat, curved, full of emotion pressed into every line. The first few entries were mundane, recipes, local gossip, weather complaints. But midway through, the tone changed. The date read March 1997. Daniel came home late again. He looked broken, said something about Cornelius Brent. I told him to leave it alone. He said it was too late for that. Clara visited today. She warned me. Said the Brents were setting Daniel up. Said we had to disappear, but Daniel wouldn't run. He believed in the system. God help him. They came to the diner asking questions. Wearing suits, too polished for this town, I lied. I said I didn't know anything, but I saw the look in their eyes. They weren't here for answers. They were here to clean up. Elisa read every page, her chest tightening with each sentence. The journal wasn't just a record, it was a confession, a cry for help trapped in ink. Her mother had known. She'd carried the weight alone to protect her daughter. Now that burden passed to Elisa, but it didn't scare her. It fueled her. She returned to the city the next morning with the journal hidden inside her coat. Lucas didn't question her. He'd grown distant lately, distracted by the demands of his fading campaign. His smiles were shorter, his presence more erratic. He didn't notice the fire building in Elisa's gaze, or if he did, he mistook it for weariness. But it wasn't weariness. It was purpose. In the days that followed, Elisa began cross-referencing her mother's entries with public records. She traced names mentioned in the journal, lawyers, contractors, one retired judge. Most had vanished from the spotlight. One had died mysteriously. In 2002, his car wrapped around a tree at 3 a.m. No autopsy had been performed. Another had relocated to Panama. Coincidence didn't stretch that far. Elisa brought the journal to the garden one afternoon, sat by the ivy-covered wall, and reread her father's name like a mantra. Daniel Moreno. He'd believed in justice. He'd believed the truth would save him. Instead, it had destroyed him. But now she held pieces of the truth, not just whispers or theories, proof, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Lucas came home that evening in a sour mood. A leaked memo had sparked speculation about his involvement in a questionable housing deal. He poured himself a drink, grumbling. The media's just bored. They'll latch onto anything, parasites. Elisa watched him quietly from across the room, the journal resting in her lap, its secrets still warm on her skin. "Was your father ever involved in real estate?" she asked, tone feather-light. Lucas looked up, startled. "Why would you ask that?" Elisa smiled. "Just curious. The house feels like it has stories." Lucas didn't answer. He studied her for a moment, then turned away. "You're thinking too much," he said. "That's not your role in this." Elisa didn't respond. She just stared at him, calm, unreadable. In that moment, she wasn't afraid of him. She pitied him because he still believed she was a prop in his performance, still thought she was here to play wife, to make him look whole. But she hadn't married a man. She'd married a system, and she was preparing to bury both. The invitation had arrived on thick cream-colored cardstock, embossed in gold. Annual Brent Foundation Gala. A mandatory affair for the city's elite. Politicians, donors, legacy, families and media power players. Lucas's team saw it as the perfect opportunity to rebrand him once again, to present the new Lucas beside his humble and loving wife. Elisa saw it for what it really was, theatre. She chose her, dressed carefully, satin black, understated, elegant. It wasn't designed to draw attention, but it made her presence unignorable. She looked like someone who belonged, even though she never truly would. As Lucas adjusted his cufflinks in the mirror, he glanced at her and muttered, "Try to be gracious tonight. These people matter." Elisa nodded, her voice calm. "Of course, I always am." The ballroom shimmered with money. Chandeliers cast golden light across champagne glasses and sequined gowns. Laughter floated through the air. Like perfume, Lucas worked the room with ease, greeting donors with practiced warmth, offering subtle nods to journalists he liked, avoiding the ones he didn't. Elisa stayed a step behind him, quiet but observant, always observing. The dinner portion of the evening began with speeches. First came the foundation's director, then a mayoral candidate, then finally Lucas himself. He took the stage with the confident ease of someone who had done this 100 times. But there was an edge to him tonight. Impatience, maybe, or pride. He introduced Elisa with what should have been a sweet anecdote, and turned it into a display. "My wife," he said, gesturing to her at their table, "came from the kind of place politicians like me talk about in speeches. Small town, modest roots, waitressing her way through life. But she's proof that anyone can rise, if given the right opportunity." The room chuckled politely. Elisa felt her stomach tighten. "She didn't know much about this world," Lucas continued, "but she's learning. She's learning how to dress for these events, how to sit through policy discussions, even how to hold a wine glass correctly." More polite laughter. Elisa smiled. Small, frozen, precise. And that's when she made her move. After the speeches, the mingling resumed. Elisa excused herself briefly, weaving through the crowd toward the far end of the ballroom, where a young journalist stood, scribbling notes. He was new, just 2 years into the political beat, but sharp and hungry. She'd noticed him watching her earlier, curiosity behind his cautious eyes. "Mr. Rowan," she said gently, tapping his shoulder. He turned, surprised. "Mrs. Brent." Yes?" She smiled, voice soft. "If I gave you a name, would you know where to look?" He blinked. "Depends on the name." She leaned in, close enough that her perfume caught his breath. "C. Moreno, 1997. Look into Brent and Holden Development Corp." She turned and walked away before he could ask questions. Back at the table, Lucas was sipping whiskey and basking in the attention. He didn't notice her exchange, but others had. Rosa Heldon, the daughter of Lucas's old business partner, had watched the moment with narrowed eyes, and she wasn't the only one. Whispers followed Elisa back to her seat like smoke. Later that evening, as guests began to drift toward dessert and dancing, Lucas noticed the change in mood. People were more reserved around him, their smiles forced, their questions sharper. "Did something happen?" he muttered to Marcus. "No idea," Marcus replied, though he was already checking his phone for media alerts. In the limo ride home, Lucas stared out the window, jaw tight. "You embarrassed me," he said finally. Elisa didn't look at him. I smiled. I was gracious. "Exactly what you asked." He turned, his voice low and hard. "Don't play games. With me." Her gaze met his, steady, unreadable. "I don't play games, Lucas. I endure them." That night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Elisa stood in the hallway, staring at her own reflection in the antique mirror near the staircase. She touched the edge of the frame, her fingers tracing a delicate crack near the corner. It wasn't visible, unless you knew where to look, just like the fractures in Lucas's empire. In her room, she opened her notebook and wrote down 2 new names she'd overheard whispered during the gala. She was building a web, and tonight she had planted her first spider. The next morning, a new article appeared on a niche political blog, quoting an anonymous source who hinted at a missing Brent family file linked to early real estate dealings. The name C. Moreno appeared once, buried in the 5th paragraph, a flicker, a test balloon. Lucas read it over breakfast and nearly choked on his coffee. "Who the hell is leaking this garbage?" he spat. Elisa glanced at the screen. "Sounds old. Maybe just someone from the past resurfacing." He didn't reply. He just stared at her, like trying to read a book written in a language he never bothered to learn. Lucas was never a man of introspection. He believed in optics, not introspection. Appearances, not authenticity. But now, as his name trended, in whispers rather than headlines, and articles began asking questions that hadn't been asked in decades, something unfamiliar gnawed at him. Doubt. And all of it, he realized, had begun after Elisa entered his life. He didn't want to believe it. She was a waitress, for God's sake, a girl with no college degree, no known connections, no past of consequence. But she was too still, too composed. Her silence didn't scream insecurity, it echoed intent. Lucas began reviewing everything he knew about her, which, to his growing frustration, wasn't much. The dossier Marcus had given him months ago was thin, too thin. Elisa, meanwhile, was expanding her web. With the subtlety of someone who had spent years learning to listen between the lines, she started engaging with people close to Lucas. His secretary Angela was the first. A polite conversation in the hallway about flower arrangements led to a coffee chat where Elisa dropped a name, Brent and Holden's restructuring in '96, and watched Angela freeze. "Oh, I wouldn't know about that," Angela said too quickly. Elisa just smiled and changed the subject. The hook was set. Next came Matteo, the chauffeur. Elisa asked him about old routes Lucas's father used to take, feigning curiosity about getting to know the family legacy. Matteo hesitated. Back then, there was this one address Cornelius always went to, abandoned warehouse now, but it was active once. Late nights. No idea what went on there. Elisa thanked him, made a note, and later sent that location to the journalist, Rowan, with no signature, just, "You're looking in the right direction." Her third target was Madison Clark, Lucas's ex-lover. A socialite with a mean streak and a memory that worked better when paired with gin. Elisa invited her to lunch under the guise of woman-to-woman understanding. Madison accepted out of sheer curiosity. "I thought you were just a prop," Madison said, swirling her drink, "but you've got eyes that say otherwise." "I'm curious," Elisa replied, calm. "Lucas has been under so much pressure lately. I keep hearing names. Holden, Moreno, warehouse on Hunter Avenue. I just want to understand what I married into." Madison paused. Her face, for once, softened. "You're asking dangerous questions, darling." She leaned forward. "Cornelius was the shadow behind every move Lucas ever made. If there's rot in the tree, it started with him. And trust me, that tree had roots everywhere. Back at the Brent mansion, Lucas was unraveling. Marcus brought him the analytics on media coverage. There's movement, small stories tying you back to Holden. Nothing big, but coordinated. Feels like a campaign." Lucas snapped. "Find the source. Leak something on another candidate. I want this buried." But Elisa had already planted her seed. She wasn't trying to destroy Lucas overnight. She was wearing down the foundation. One name, one file, one witness at a time. Each person she approached became a node, each name a thread. She was weaving her truth beneath the surface of his narrative. Lucas began noticing the shifts. Angela, was colder. Matteo seemed nervous. Even Marcus kept checking his phone, distracted. "They're slipping," Lucas muttered. "Someone's pulling them." And then, as if a bolt of lightning struck his brain, he looked across the room at Elisa. He started tailing her movements, discreetly at first. He asked Marcus to tap her calls, check her laptop. Nothing. Clean. Too clean. "She's hiding." "Something," Lucas said, "but she's too smart to leave fingerprints." That night, Lucas confronted her in the sitting room. "You've been different," he said, voice low, "since the gala." Elisa looked up from her book. "I've just been learning to adjust." "To what?" "To being invisible," she said. "It's a strange kind of freedom. No one expects you to see anything, or remember." Lucas tilted his head. "What is it you think you've seen?" She smiled. "I see a man afraid of his own legacy." Silence stretched between them. Lucas stepped closer, looming. "Don't test me, Elisa. You're here because I let you be, because I needed you to be." She closed the book. "You needed someone no one would question, someone no one would believe," and with that she stood and walked past him, calm as ever, notebook in hand. Lucas stood alone in the silence, rattled. For the first time, he didn't feel like the one controlling the stage. He felt like a character in someone else's script. He just didn't know the ending yet. The address Elisa wrote down in her notebook had been circled 3 times. Ramon Dantas, private investigator, retired. The name had surfaced in her father's journal, tucked into a list titled "Trusted, Maybe." That hesitation spoke volumes. But it also meant Ramon had once stood near the truth, closer than most, and Elisa was running out of people who hadn't been bought, silenced, or buried. His house sat just outside the city, nestled in a patch of land that hadn't seen renovation since the 90s. When she knocked, she expected silence. Instead, the door opened with a metallic creak, and an old man stared out, eyes sharp beneath thick brows. "I don't do cases anymore," he said flatly. "I'm not here with a case," Elisa replied. "I'm here with a name, Daniel Moreno." He studied her for a beat longer, then stepped aside. No invitation, just permission. Inside, the walls were lined with boxes instead of art, stacks of paper maps, photos, folders yellowed with time. Ramon walked slowly, each step deliberate, like memory itself had weight. "I remember Daniel. Good man, naive. He believed the system could save him." Elisa followed him to a cluttered kitchen, her voice low. "You investigated his case?" "Briefly, before I was warned off. My office was trashed a week later. Phone lines tapped. Brent's people knew how to clean house." Elisa opened her notebook and pulled out a copy of her father's letter, the one addressed to Clara. She laid it on the table. "This is all I have," my father's voice, "and a journal. But he mentions you. He thought you might have kept the originals, proof of what Cornelius did." Ramon looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. "You're his daughter," he said. "You're the one they were afraid would grow up asking questions." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. He rose and disappeared into another room. When he returned, he held a locked tin file box. "I've had this buried for 20 years. I thought maybe one day someone like you would come knocking." He handed her the key. "But you need to understand something. This doesn't just burn Lucas Brent. It scorches half the old guard. You drop this and everything falls." She nodded. "That's the point." Back at the mansion, Elisa worked with surgical precision. She photocopied everything: wire transfers signed by Cornelius Brent, shell company documentation, contracts signed under false identities, all connected to the downfall of Daniel Moreno. The puzzle pieces weren't just incriminating, they were damning. Meanwhile, Lucas's paranoia had metastasized. He changed passcodes, fired 2 staffers without explanation. He watched Elisa more closely, but the more he watched, the less. He understood her. She moved like a woman without fear, as if his world no longer mattered, and that terrified him more than anything. Elisa planted a subtle seed in Marcus during a short, accidental hallway conversation. "You know, it's strange," she said, "how many names keep circling back to the Brent family, even before Lucas's campaign, back when Cornelius was alive." Marcus, always pragmatic, blinked. "What do you mean?" "Just patterns," she murmured, then walked away. The next day she returned to Ramon. He handed her a USB drive. "These are scans of everything. Keep them separate from the hard copies. If they come after you, they'll look for paper." He paused. "You sure you want to do this? You could walk away. Disappear." Elisa shook her head. "They took my father. They took my aunt. They tried to erase them. I can't disappear." That night, she returned to her room and hid the physical files behind a false panel in her closet. The USB drive she tucked into the spine of a hollowed-out poetry book. It wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about controlling the release. Timing was everything. Lucas finally confronted her in the study. "You're hiding something," he said, eyes narrowed. "I'm hiding many things," she replied softly, "but nothing you'd understand." He stepped closer, anger simmering. "I gave you a life." "You gave me a stage," she said, not backing down, "and I'm just beginning my performance." For the first time, Lucas faltered. She wasn't bluffing, and he could feel it. Elisa left the study and walked to the garden. The air was sharp, the night silent. She looked up at the stars, imagining her father's voice, her aunt's smile, the nights her mother wept without a sound. They tried to bury her family's story, but graves don't keep secrets forever. Lucas Brent stood in his private study long after midnight, staring at his reflection in the glass of the liquor cabinet. His face looked older than it had. A month ago, tightened jaw, grayer at the temples, eyes like someone being followed by a question he couldn't answer. Something was wrong, not just in the papers or the polls, something inside his own house. He poured a second drink, the ice clinking loud in the silence. Across the room, a half-finished campaign strategy sat untouched. None of it mattered anymore. Not the donors, not the handshakes. It all felt brittle, fragile. And the crack, he realized, started with Elisa. She had become too quiet, not meek, not submissive, strategically quiet, observant, composed, calculated. He used to think she was overwhelmed by his world, but now he suspected she was dissecting it, watching everyone, measuring the structure for weak spots. The next morning, Lucas tracked her schedule. She claimed to be going to a charity luncheon, but he sent Marcus to follow her discreetly. She didn't go to the luncheon. She went to a residential address outside the city, an old house. When Marcus returned and handed him the name of the occupant, Ramon Dantas, Lucas nearly dropped the paper. The name was from a file his father had once warned him about. A man who didn't stay, bought. "Find out what she gave him," Lucas said, "or what he gave her." But Marcus hesitated. "We're not in the 90s anymore, Lucas. People don't vanish without questions." Lucas's eyes narrowed. "Then we don't make him vanish. We ruin him." Elisa, meanwhile, returned from her visit unchanged in appearance, but sharpened in focus. She entered the house like a woman who had made peace with her war. That night, she dined with Lucas as though nothing had happened. The conversation was light, dull. But when he casually asked, "You see anyone interesting today?" she smiled. "Just an old friend of the family. He used to know my father." Lucas froze mid-bite. That was the first time she'd mentioned her father by name since they met. "Was he close with your family?" Lucas asked, tone flat. "Very," she said softly. "He knew the people who took everything from us." Lucas didn't speak. The silence between them wasn't tense. It was surgical, a silent cut, deep and intentional. After dinner, Lucas went straight to the archives. He tore through the Brent files, looking for the name Daniel Moreno. He found it in an old newspaper, clipping attached to a corruption scandal tied to a land transfer deal his father had orchestrated. Cornelius had walked away clean. Moreno had been ruined. Suicide, they said, but the article mentioned a surviving daughter, name redacted. That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling the same way Elisa had on her first night.
In the mansion only now, it was him who felt watched. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps behind him.
He searched Elisa's room while she was out, found nothing, no files, no names, no laptop even, just books, hundreds of them, and one blank notebook. But Lucas knew something was there. He just didn't know where or how deep. At breakfast, he dropped the question like a stone into a still pond. Your father, what did he do? Elisa didn't flinch. He tried to be honest in a dishonest world. It killed him. Lucas nodded slowly, picking up his glass. Some men just aren't built for politics. She looked at him across the table. Some men build politics to destroy other men. That night, Elisa met the journalist again, Rowan, in a parking garage. She handed him a folder with 3 documents, contracts linking Cornelius Brent to shell companies, scanned memos of bribes, and one handwritten note that mentioned Moreno handled clean exit. Rowan was speechless. You want me to go public? Not yet, she said. One more piece, then you publish. Lucas was unraveling. He called a private tech firm to sweep Elisa's room again. Still nothing. It enraged him. He didn't know where she was hiding her arsenal, but he could feel its edge drawing closer. The poles were slipping. Rumors swirled in editorial circles. Reporters whispered about a Brent family reckoning. Lucas knew the feeling of control slipping from his grip. He cornered Elisa in the hallway one evening, voice low and tight. You're acting strange. You're not the woman I married. She tilted her head. You're right. I never was. Who are you? I'm your consequence, she said, walking past him. Lucas stood frozen, the weight of that truth landing harder than any headline ever could. The morning was too quiet. Even the birds seemed unsure whether to sing. Lucas Brent sat in the sunroom, scrolling through his tablet, expecting to find the usual cocktail of public adoration and polite media fear. But something was different today. A message from Marcus blinked at the top of the screen. Call me, now. Before Lucas could respond, his phone buzzed again. Another alert, then another. The headlines weren't centered on a rival or a scandal out of state. They were aimed directly at him. Anonymous source leaks Brent family financial ties to 1990s fraud scheme. Lucas froze. The words Brent and Halden, Daniel Moreno, and Shell Corporations swam before his eyes. He burst into Marcus's office an hour later. What the hell is this? Marcus didn't look up from his desk. It's the beginning. What does that mean? It means someone just planted a nuke in the middle of your reputation. And it's only the first blast. Lucas stormed out, fury burning beneath his skin, but somewhere deep down, beneath the rage, was something colder. Fear. A specific, calculated kind of fear, the kind a man feels when he realizes he isn't just being watched. He's being dismantled. Back at the mansion, Elisa was playing piano. Something soft, minor key. Her fingers moved across the ivory as if playing a memory. Lucas watched her from the doorway, expression unreadable. Did you do it? He asked. She didn't stop playing. Do what? The leak. She let the final chord ring out before answering. I don't leak, Lucas. I release. He stepped into the room. There's a difference? She turned, calm as always. Leaks are accidents. Releases are justice. Lucas clenched his fists. You planted something, didn't you? Something in the house. She tilted her head. "You should check the coffer in your father's office. Maybe someone left you a parting gift." And with that, she stood and walked past him, silent as shadow. Lucas rushed to the east wing, heart thudding. He opened the old safe behind Cornelius's desk, a place he hadn't touched in years. It was supposed to be empty. But now, nestled atop a stack of dust-covered ledgers, sat a file marked M. Harbour Contract, 1997. Inside were two memos with his father's signature and a detailed map showing illegal land rezoning, a file that could only have come from someone inside. Just then, his phone rang. A voice on the other end, gravelly, angry, powerful, a party donor. "Lucas, what is this? They're saying you've got dirt from your father's days all over your campaign. You better fix this, fast." Lucas hung up, his world spinning. He wasn't being attacked. He was being peeled apart, layer by layer, by someone who knew exactly where the rot lay. That night, a warrant was executed. A judge, responding to an anonymous tip, ordered a quiet sweep of the Brent estate. It wasn't a full raid, but enough to rattle the windows. Federal agents entered under legal guise and began reviewing misplaced documents within the private collection of Cornelius Brent. Lucas stood by, jaw clenched, as they confiscated the file Elisa had mentioned. He looked at her across the foyer. She stood with her arms crossed, eyes steady. Lucas stepped toward her. "Why are you doing this?" "You know why. I gave you everything." "You gave me proximity," she said. "I took everything else myself." Lucas couldn't think, couldn't breathe. He paced his office long after the agents left. Everything was falling apart. The whispers were turning into accusations. The media smelled blood. He turned to Marcus again, wild-eyed. "Find out who she really is. I want her past, her family. I don't care how buried it is. I want it." But Marcus had already tried. He looked up slowly and said, "Lucas, I think she's way ahead of us." Meanwhile, Elisa sat alone in her room, holding her father's photo. She lit a candle, not for mourning, but for memory. "You were erased," she whispered, "but I remember, and now so will they." The next morning, headlines screamed, "Anonymous files link Lucas Brent to historic land fraud scandal." Anonymous sources within the government confirmed the investigation had been reopened. Lucas Brent's political future was no longer in question. It was in free fall, and for the first time since she walked into that mansion, Elisa slept through the night. The article dropped at dawn, no byline, no official source, just an image, grainy and dark, of a woman standing at a protest in 1997, a red scarf tied around her neck, fist raised. The headline read, "Who was Clara Moreno? The woman who vanished to save the truth." Within minutes, it was shared across social media. Within an hour, it reached every news desk in the country. Elisa watched the fire spread, from her seat at the kitchen counter, sipping black coffee as if it were just another day. But this wasn't another day. It was the day Clara returned from the dead. The article laid everything out like a crime scene. Clara Moreno, sister to Daniel Moreno, was a fierce activist in the late 90s. She'd publicly accused Brent and Holden of orchestrating fraudulent land seizures. Her brother Daniel was blamed for the scandal. Days after his death, Clara disappeared. Authorities labeled her a radical, a ghost. But now, someone had connected the dots, and the dots all led back to the Brents. Lucas burst into the room, phone in hand. His face was pale, lips tight. "What did you do?" Elisa looked up slowly. "I told the truth. You don't know her. You don't know what she was." Elisa stood, walking toward him. "I know she believed in something, and I know she disappeared the moment your father needed her to." Lucas stepped back, fury rippling beneath his calm. "If she's alive, she's dangerous. She'll burn everything. That's the point." Elsewhere, Rowan, the journalist, was chasing a new lead. The photo of Clara had stirred memories. Former activists, now older and quieter, began reaching out. One of them, a man named Tomas, claimed he'd seen Clara alive in Ecuador 5 years ago, living under a new name. She had scars on her arms, said she'd escaped something, said she didn't regret it. Rowan shared the lead with Elisa. She said nothing, only closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to remember her aunt's laugh. The memory was faint, a flash of red fabric, a smell of tobacco and citrus, and a voice that had once told her, "They'll try to erase you, so you leave pieces of yourself in people's memories. They can't erase everyone." Lucas's campaign went into meltdown. Donors were fleeing. Internal staff leaked resignation letters. The party chairman requested a leave of absence from Lucas, effective immediately. His face was on every screen now, but not as a candidate. As a legacy unraveling. In a final act of control, Lucas called a press conference. He intended to redirect, to spin, to reframe. But as he stepped up to the podium, the first question wasn't about his policies. It was about Clara. "Mr. Brent, did your father order the disappearance of Clara Moreno to protect his company?" Lucas froze. In the silence that followed, everything cracked. That night, Elisa stood in the garden, watching the news coverage fade from control to chaos. She didn't smile. This wasn't joy, it was justice, a slow, patient burn. And yet, there was still a question that haunted her. Was Clara really still alive? The next morning, she received a plain envelope in the mailbox. No stamp, no address. Just her name. Inside was a photograph, modern, color, high definition. A woman with grey-streaked black hair stood behind a market stall in Quito, smiling at a child. Around her neck was a red scarf. On the back of the photo, written in careful handwriting, "I never died, but I needed to become a ghost. You've made me visible again. See." Elisa held the photo to her chest, breath trembling. Clara had lived. Survived, waited, and now she was watching. Lucas, meanwhile, sat alone in his father's study, watching the empire his family built collapse in real time. The past he thought was buried had risen with claws. The woman he thought he controlled had pulled every thread, and somewhere out there, a ghost was walking among the living. He poured himself another drink, and this time he didn't toast. Lucas was unraveling. There were no more press statements, no more late-night spin sessions with Marcus, no more carefully staged handshakes. The Brent name was radioactive. His political allies had retreated like ants from a burning hill, and the party issued a statement distancing itself from any actions committed prior to Mr. Brent's current candidacy. A polite way of saying, "You're done." The house was different now, too. The staff spoke in hushed tones. The halls echoed more. Elisa moved through it like a phantom, the same way she'd done when she first arrived. But now she wasn't observing. She was claiming. Lucas had barely left the East Wing in 2 days. When he finally emerged, it wasn't to apologize or to explain. It was to confront. She was in the reading room, curled into a chair with a folder resting on her lap. His voice cracked through the silence like a whip. "Who the hell are you?" Elisa closed the file. She looked up, steady. "I'm your wife. Don't insult me." "I'm not. I took the vows. I wore the ring. I played the role." Lucas stepped closer, his voice rising. "You lied about who you are. You set me up. You planted files. You've destroyed everything." She stood, slowly, folder still in hand. "I didn't destroy anything, Lucas. Your father did that. You just kept pretending you could live in the house he built without ever checking the foundation." Lucas's face twisted with rage. "You used me." She took a step forward. "I used the stage. You gave me a spotlight." He threw his hands into the air. "So what now? You win? You've burned my name, my career. What, you walk away clean?" Elisa paused, her voice dropping. "Do you know what it's like to have your last name whispered like a curse for 20 years? to see people look at you and think of shame, of scandal, of something you didn't do. I grew up in the shadow of your family's empire. I buried my father before I could drive. I watched my mother work herself into silence. I spent half my life hiding." Lucas stared at her, and for the first time he saw it, not just the fury, not just the plan, the grief, the damage. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he whispered. "Because you wouldn't have believed me. You would have done what your father did, called me unstable, made me disappear." There was a beat of silence. Then Lucas said quietly, "You still haven't told me everything." Elisa smiled, faintly. "You're right." She didn't tell him about the files ready to drop to every major news outlet if anything happened to her. She didn't tell him about the anonymous trust fund already prepared for legal retaliation, and she didn't tell him that Clara had reached out, alive, careful, watching. "You'll never understand," she said, "because you were born into power. I was born into silence. I learned how to wear your world like a costume, but I never belonged to it." Lucas stepped back. He looked hollow now, tired, beaten not by scandal, but by truth. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I already did it," she replied. That night, Elisa left the study and walked to the sitting room, where the portrait of Cornelius still hung. She stared at it. The man who'd buried her father, erased her aunt, and built an empire on falsehoods. She whispered, "I told your story." They finally listened. Then she lit a match. It wasn't for the fire, though part of her longed for that. It was for the scent, the memory, the signal. She returned to her room and sat at her desk, notebook open. One final note. "The mask is off. He sees me now, but it's too late." And in the hallway, Lucas watched her from the shadows. He didn't recognize the woman he'd married. He realized he never had. It happened at 7:03 a.m. Every major news outlet, from the legacy networks to the scrappy digital warriors, received the same encrypted package. The subject line was simple: "The truth about Brent and Halden." Inside was a trove of documents, legal filings, forged contracts, payment records, photographs, and personal notes, along with a neatly typed statement. These documents were preserved for decades in silence. "We release them now in the name of those who never got to speak. CM." Within minutes, the Brent files was trending. Within the hour, a panel of legal analysts appeared live, stunned. "This isn't just a scandal," one said. "This is an expose on decades of white-collar corruption, covered in fingerprints." Lucas Brent didn't need anyone to explain it to him. He woke to the sound of his phone buzzing non-stop. Messages, missed calls, news alerts. His first instinct was to call Marcus, but Marcus didn't pick up. His second instinct was to call the party chairman, but the number had been disconnected. His third instinct was to break the glass of the mirror in his hallway. Elisa, however, didn't stir. She sat on the patio with tea and a copy of the Washington Ledger, a special early edition printed in haste. The front-page headline read, "Wife of Lucas Brent, linked to family targeted in early corruption scandal." Below that, "She is Daniel Moreno's daughter." The air was electric. In D.C., pundits called for hearings. In Brent's home state, protests erupted outside the campaign office. Government watchdogs demanded resignations. Even corporate sponsors who had once courted the Brent family now issued public apologies. Inside the Brent mansion, Lucas roamed the halls like a trapped animal. The one place that had always belonged to him now felt like someone else's house. His father's portrait had been removed overnight. Only the outline remained on the wallpaper, like the ghost of a man no longer welcome. Elisa stayed in her room most of the day. She received 2 encrypted texts, one from Rowan, "We're running it all, even Clara's story, everything." The second was from a number she didn't recognize but knew instinctively. "He always underestimated us. You didn't. See?" At noon, she walked into the sunroom where Lucas sat, head in hands. She placed a folder on the table, unlabeled but already familiar to him. The final blow. "I gave them everything," she said, "but I saved this. For you, so you'd know it wasn't vengeance, it was truth." Lucas looked up, eyes red. "You killed my name." "No," Elisa said. "Your name died the moment your father built his empire with blood money. I just gave it a proper burial." He stared at her, the fight gone. "Why didn't you just destroy me quietly?" "Because that's not justice. That's revenge. And this isn't about you." She turned to leave. Lucas stood slowly. "So what now?" "You disappear," she said, "the way my family did. Only difference is, yours will be remembered for what it truly was." That night, the leaked files were confirmed by independent legal sources. Subpoenas followed. Investigations opened. Statutes of limitations didn't cover everything. People were nervous. People who had long thought themselves untouchable. Elisa didn't appear on camera. She didn't give interviews, but she made one exception. A sit-down with Rowan. Simple setting. One camera. No makeup. "I didn't do this to become someone," she said. "I did it because I already was someone. They just tried to erase that." The clip went viral within hours. People started calling her the Quiet Fire. Lucas watched the video in the dark, alone. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose everything. And, no, it was earned. For weeks, the headlines didn't move on. They multiplied. Elisa Brent, the woman who unmasked a dynasty. Daniel Moreno's daughter breaks decades-long silence. Justice rewritten. How a marriage brought down the Brents. The public was no longer asking if the allegations were true. They were asking how long the truth had been buried and how many others had helped shovel the dirt. More files came to light. More Brent allies issued statements, suddenly rediscovering their moral compass. But the name that stayed on every tongue wasn't Brent. It was Moreno. The press clamored for a statement. Elisa refused for days, even as her face appeared on every screen. She wasn't hiding, she was waiting. And then one morning she walked into the same auditorium where Lucas had launched his campaign months ago. No stage lights this time, no velvet curtain. Just a single microphone and a room full of journalists. She wore no makeup, no designer dress, just a black blouse and her father's watch on her wrist. "My name," she began, "is Elisa Moreno." A murmur passed through the room. "I married into the Brent family to survive a world that told me I wasn't worth listening to. I stayed silent while the name of my father was erased, while people whispered his death was guilt, not grief, while my mother lived in the shadows of a lie." She paused. "I am the daughter of Daniel Moreno, an honest man who was buried by power. And I am the niece of Clara Moreno, who disappeared not because she was afraid, but because she was dangerous to those who wanted the truth gone." The flash of cameras lit up the room. Reporters began shouting questions. She raised a hand, not to silence them, but to steady herself. "I didn't come here to tear down a man. I came here to hold up the truth. We talk about justice like it's something loud, but it isn't. Justice is patient. It waits in quiet rooms. It lives in documents, in scars, in the voices of people we try to forget. And it always, eventually, walks back into the room." Lucas, watching from the mansion, didn't finish the video. He turned it off before she said anything more. There was nothing left for him to hear. Later that afternoon, Elisa filed for annulment. It wasn't dramatic, no press release, just a simple filing at the county clerk's office, a clean severing of the final legal tie. But she didn't stop there. A week later, she announced the formation of the Moreno Foundation for Transparency, a legal defense fund for whistleblowers and families destroyed by political corruption. It wasn't about her story. It was about every story like hers that never made it to the surface. The public loved her, but she didn't run for office, didn't publish a book, didn't sign a talk show contract. She declined them all, because this was never about fame. It was about memory. One reporter asked her gently, in the final moments of a soft interview, "Do you feel powerful now?" Elisa smiled. Not warm, not cold, just honest. "I feel seen." The mansion was quiet now, not heavy, not haunted, just still. Lucas had moved out weeks ago, selling the estate to a private trust. No press conference, no farewell tour, just boxes, trucks, and a whisper of wind through empty rooms. He vanished from public life in the only way disgraced men could, quietly, without ceremony, dragging the weight of his father's sins behind him. Elisa never went back inside after the annulment. She didn't need to. The house had already served its purpose. It had been the vault for decades of silence, and she had cracked it open, slowly, patiently, surgically. Now all that remained of that world were headlines, court dates, and the whisper of her name echoing through the halls of power. But she hadn't done it for a headline. She never had. She moved into a small apartment above a bookstore near the university. Nothing fancy, nothing performative, just hers, and for the first time in years she began to write. Not reports, not files, not notes in the margins of someone else's narrative, but memories, her story, Clara's, Daniel's, a mosaic of what justice looked like when it didn't wear a suit. The Moreno Foundation gained momentum fast. Whistleblowers reached out. Victims of past cover-ups found lawyers. One woman, whose husband had been ruined by a contract nearly identical to Daniel's, sent Elisa a letter handwritten in blue ink. "You gave me back my name. I forgot what it sounded like." Every week, Elisa lit a candle for her father, not because she needed ritual, but because it grounded her, because she'd promised herself that when this was over, he would be more than the man the papers once called a disgraced official. He would be a man whose daughter rewrote the ending. Clara remained out of sight, but not out of reach. Once a month, a postcard arrived from a new country, always unsigned, always with a red dot in the corner. Elisa never replied. There was no need. They had said everything in the fire. They both survived. One evening, as Elisa walked home from a foundation board meeting, a young reporter approached her on the sidewalk. She was barely out of college, nervous, recorder in hand. "Ms. Moreno," she said, "can I ask one question?" Elisa smiled gently. "One." The reporter hesitated. "Do you ever regret marrying him?" Elisa paused. The streetlight glowed above them. "No," she said, "because marrying him got me close enough to break the machine from inside." "And now?" the reporter asked. "Now I'm not inside anymore." The reporter thanked her and walked off. Elisa stood there a moment longer, breathing in the quiet. Not silence born of suppression, but peace born of closure. In the final weeks of fall, she gave one last televised statement, short, composed, unscripted. "I never wanted power," she said. "I wanted the truth to walk freely again. It took years, it cost everything, but it was never about revenge. It was about remembering." The camera didn't pan to a crowd or cue music. It just lingered on her face, quiet and steady. And then, for the first time, the story faded, not because people forgot, but because it had been told completely. Elisa walked through the city alone the next morning, scarf wrapped tight against the wind. The headlines had moved on, but the legacy of what she did remained. She didn't want applause. She wanted clarity, and she got it. If you've made it this far, let us know what you thought about the story. Rate it from 1 to 10 in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're not subscribed yet, don't forget to subscribe to catch all our upcoming stories.